the US, so I did undergrad in the US and then my postgraduate studies in the UK. And I'm part of a quite significant team of researchers who are all interested in this issue of performance-enhancing drug use in sport. And so you can see here some of my colleagues as well as some of the various organizations that we've had the opportunity to conduct research for. So that just gives you a little bit of background of me and kind of why I'm the one sharing this information with you today. But in the actual webinar today, as you hopefully saw in the overview, we're going to be talking about REACT, and I'm going to start with giving you kind of some of the research underpinning it. So why did we create REACT in the first place? What's it based on? Then I'm going to talk to you about the actual content of delivery. So I'm going to share with you some of the actual resources and slides that we use within the sessions. And then I'm going to share with you some of the preliminary findings. And this will make more sense kind of as we go, as each of them builds on one another. But as Laura said, if you've got any questions or if you need clarity about anything at any point, please feel free to shoot those questions to her. And if they're kind of relevant in that moment, I've already given her permission to just kind of interrupt me as I go. So feel free to ask any questions that you might have. Just to kind of give you some information about where this program started, why we thought it was necessary. My PhD research looked at how the university environment influences student athletes' attitudes, experiences, and behaviors towards performance-enhancing drugs in sport. And I interviewed student athletes in the US and the UK and looked to compare kind of those two environments. And one of the things that came out of this research was out of the 28 student athletes, 27 out of 28 said that they would be strongly opposed to using performance-enhancing drugs. So essentially, I asked them, if you were given an opportunity to use performance-enhancing drugs right now, would you be tempted? And 27 out of 28 said, no, not interested at all. And you can see here the publication that has come from this. But following that question, I then asked them, if you knew that a teammate or competitor was using performance-enhancing drugs, would you report them? And to my surprise, less than half of the participants suggested that they would. And of those, even fewer suggested actually reporting, instead suggesting that they would go to a coach or someone of that nature, essentially somebody that could keep this information in-house. And given the current state of sport, and I don't know how familiar each of you are with what's kind of going on a global scale, but really at every level, individuals are being increasingly encouraged and expected to play a role in discouraging banned substance use in sport. And our traditional view to this has been that if an individual becomes aware of banned substance use, they really have two options. They can either blow the whistle and report it, or they can do nothing. And within my research, amongst this group who was strongly opposed to personally using performance-enhancing drugs, yet hesitant to actually blow the whistle, essentially participants were anticipating that they would do nothing if they became aware of performance-enhancing drug use or banned substance use more broadly. And so in that sense, they were suggesting that they would act as a bystander. And a bystander is somebody that is present in a situation or witnesses a situation, but doesn't get involved, doesn't intervene. And so given our traditional view of how to address performance-enhancing drugs, student athletes in my research were suggesting they would serve as a bystander. Importantly, though, when I went back to that data, I quickly noticed that they weren't necessarily suggesting they would act as a bystander. Instead, what they were suggesting is perhaps there's more than two options for addressing banned substance use in sport. And so what you see here is an illustration of student athletes' responses in relation to how they would address banned substance use. So what we have on the right is the traditional approach, which I just showed you, that is you can either ignore the behavior or you can report it to authorities, so blow the whistle. But in addition, student athletes suggested that you could report to someone, and that was most often their coach, or what they would be most inclined to do would be to confront that banned substance user directly. And in determining which of the 4 options to choose, they generally considered 3 questions. The first was, who is the performance-enhancing drug user, or essentially, what is my relationship with them? And then, what are the potential consequences for me if I blow the whistle? And also, what are the potential consequences for the performance-enhancing drug user? And generally, the closer the relationship, the greater the presumed consequences for both. And so what we see here is that relationships appear to be quite significant in determining how student athletes would address banned substance use. And, you know, within this research, you notice a hesitation towards reporting doping, and yet this potential willingness to confront banned substance use, or banned substance users more specifically. And the reality is, not everybody's going to be willing and able to blow the whistle, regardless of the context, regardless of the specific type of wrongdoing. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't do something in the pursuit of clean sport. And so what we're doing, well, really, this is what kind of prompted the vision and the creation of REACT, was this idea that, you know, student athletes are suggesting that they feel strongly opposed to banned substance use in sport, and yet they don't necessarily feel comfortable reporting. However, they might be willing to confront. But importantly, they commonly followed up that suggestion by saying, but I know that's not what you're supposed to do, meaning that, you know, they know they're supposed to report. And, you know, really the idea of REACT is, well, yes, you know, that is an encouraged option. However, if you're not going to be willing to do that, that doesn't mean you can't do something. And so we're trying to encourage student athletes to do something in this context, and really to equip them to be able to do that. And so this is kind of the foundation of REACT. This is what prompted the vision of it. And so just to kind of give you a big overview of REACT, as I said, it stands for Recognize and Take Action. And as Laura said, it's a clean sport bystander intervention program. We've adopted the framework of STEP UP, which some of you guys may be familiar with. It's used quite regularly within the NCAA context, but it's essentially a bystander intervention framework. And the project is being funded by the International Olympic Committee, and we're delivering it to student athletes in the US, the UK, and Canada, and to athletes across all sports. And to date, we have delivered it to student athletes in the US and Canada. And so I'm going to be able to, at the end, share with you some preliminary findings that have come out of delivery within those 2 countries. And starting in the fall, we'll then deliver it to the UK student athlete population, which will give us our 3 comparison groups. So the aims of REACT are to increase student athletes' awareness of intervention-worthy substance use situations. We want to increase student athletes' sense of personal responsibility to intervene in these situations. And importantly, we want to equip student athletes with the skills and confidence necessary to safely intervene. And so these are the aims that underpin both of the sessions of REACT, and I'll kind of give you an overview of how it's set up here in the next slides. The way that the project is being run is that we actually have 2 groups. So we've got our REACT group, which is the actual intervention, and then we also have a control group. And the control group is an active control, so they are actually getting something as well. And so in the control group, they take part in 1 session. It's 60 minutes. And in this session, they receive key kind of compliance messages. We've essentially adapted a National Anti-Doping Organization's education session. It's didactic in nature, and really it's just me kind of sharing with them key information, details around rules and regulations. So they are getting something in that group. Meanwhile, the REACT is the actual intervention, and so in this group, student athletes take part in 2 sessions. Universities are allowed to kind of determine what's best for them as far as how that's delivered. So for example, some universities have had me deliver on back-to-back days, whereas other universities have had me deliver on, you know, consecutive Mondays, for example. And so there's flexibility in how it's delivered, which has been absolutely critical given how busy student athletes are. But as I said, they take part in 2 sessions, and this is the first session is 75 minutes. And that introduces the theory underpinning the REACT program, and also the skills of confrontation. And then in the second session, it's 90 minutes. And in this session, we go through specific substance use kind of situations and scenarios, and they're able to apply the skills and knowledge that they gained in the first session in interactive and engaging scenarios within the second session. And so you'll get kind of a taste of how that works over the course of this webinar. And then across both groups, they fill out an evaluation, and this is done at 3 time points. So an interesting thing to note is bystander interventions have generally, well, most predominantly been used within the context of kind of sexual assault. And we've seen there's quite a number of really great programs in existence, including Step Up, which we have adopted. But what you see is that there's very little evaluation. And so that was a key thing for us with this project, is we want to actually evaluate the impact. So not based on just, you know, who participates, but on what are they actually getting from this. And so we designed an evaluation specifically for the program, and participants in both groups fill out the exact same evaluation. It takes about 5 minutes. It's paper and pen, multiple choice, and they fill it out at the start of the first session and the end of, so in the control group, it's at the start of their session and the end of their session. And then in the react group, it's at the start of the first session and the end of the second session. And then both groups are sent a online version of this survey 3 months following their participation in the program, so that we can also measure whether or not there's any long-term impact or long-term benefits. And so I'm going to share with you, as I said at the end, some of the initial findings that have come out of this evaluation. So that gives you a basic idea of kind of what REACT is and where it comes from and how it's been set up. And just to kind of give you a glimpse of the evaluation so that you have an idea of how we're measuring impact. It's broken into 5 sections, and really the keys are that we look at their attitudes towards helping, also substance use situations that they've witnessed and how they anticipate responding to those. We measure their likelihood to act in substance use situations, and I'll specify what those situations are here shortly. Their perceived skills and confidence towards confronting, as that was one of our key aims, is we want to increase that. And then also we look at social norms, so how they think their coaches and teammates would react in specific substance use situations. And then finally we measure their reported substance use behaviors to give us kind of a landscape of student-athlete substance use. So before I get into kind of giving you the sessions, Laura, if you'd like to send out the poll it'd be really interesting to see kind of what your guys' support roles are with athletes. So if you could quickly just kind of jot that in, that would be great. And I think this is a great opportunity to kind of set up the idea that, you know, this is something that is an issue that is becoming increasingly relevant to everyone involved in sport. And, you know, according to the World Anti-Doping Agency, who is the global governing body for anti-doping, athlete support personnel includes anybody who's supporting an athlete who's competing in WADA-sanctioned events. And so that includes everyone from parents to coaches to athletic trainers, really it's a number of different individuals. And so, you know, the more that we can kind of familiarize you with issues pertaining to substance use, I think the better off we're going to be at supporting individuals in this context. Cool. So we've got athletic trainers, psychology, well, kind of almost everyone except sport nutrition. Well, certainly everyone in here is, you know, has a role to play in this. And so certainly this will be something that hopefully you find quite useful. And one of the things that we want to look to do moving forward is getting you guys involved in this program. But obviously at the moment, we're targeting student athletes. And that's largely because this is where the initial issue was presented, as I said in my PhD research. So now what I'd like to do is give you an overview of the session. So as I said, it's designed so the first session is 75 minutes, and that includes time for the evaluation. And then the second session is 90 minutes, again, including time for the evaluation. Obviously, I can't take you through the entire sessions 1 and 2, but I'll give you kind of the key overview. And then certainly feel free to ask any questions if you feel like you're missing some details there. So to get started, session 1. In this session, we introduce the bystander effect, the factors that influence it, the 5 steps towards intervention, and the strategies for overcoming the bystander effect. And so I'll start out by giving them just kind of a couple scenarios, and we have a little discussion around helping behaviors, and just kind of highlighting the fact that, most people have great intentions and they plan on helping, but there's a number of factors that can influence whether or not we help. And, sometimes people with the best intentions won't help. And so it's important that we're aware of this. And so then I share with them this, which is people are less likely to help when they're in a group than when they are alone. And we call this the bystander effect. Research suggests that 80% of people will help in situations when they're alone. Meanwhile, only 20% of people will help in those situations when others are present. And so obviously there's a significant difference in the percentage of individuals who will help based largely on the number of people that are present in that situation. And so psychologists have been exploring for a number of years why this bystander effect takes place. And they've identified a number of different factors that influence, or if you will, perpetuate this effect. And so what I do with student athletes is we then go through and look at some of these factors that influence the bystander effect. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to go through them, but within the actual sessions, I contextualize most of them within the context of anti-doping. So by drawing in examples of where we have seen these factors at play within the context of anti-doping. But unfortunately, I don't have time to do that here. So just to kind of give you, I'll just rather give you kind of the context of what these factors are. And for some of you, you might be familiar with them already. So diffusion of responsibility is one of the factors that's believed to influence the bystander effect. And essentially what this is what it suggests is that the more people that are present in a situation, the less personal responsibility any one individual is going to take. So, let's say all of us on this webinar witness a situation. Well, chances are I'm going to look to one of you and think, oh, they're in a better position to help. They're more knowledgeable, they're more skilled. I'm going to let them take control. The issue here is that if we all make that assumption, we all assume somebody else is going to do something. In the end, there's a real chance that nobody does anything. And so this is one issue that has been seen to perpetuate this bystander effect. Another factor is that of conformity. And, for those of you that are involved in sport, which is all of us, we've probably had our own experiences with this. Essentially, it's where, you'll start to notice that the more you spend time around people, or in particular groups, we often start to pick up on their behaviors and beliefs of those that are around us. And this is certainly something that we see quite often within sport, as we're often spending lots of time, or athletes are spending lots of time with their teammates, is, they start to kind of act like one another. And this could be, this can be through just kind of picking up on subtle, unspoken cues, or it can be through blatant peer pressure, pressure to act like the rest of the group. And so this is another factor that can influence the bystander effect or perpetuate it. Another fairly straightforward one is that of ambiguity, and essentially this is not knowing whether or not a situation is a problem. And so here, I'll ask student athletes, like, how can we overcome this? And really one of the simplest ways is just to ask questions. So encouraging them to ask questions and say, if you're not sure, ask questions to get a bigger picture. Another factor is obedience to authority, and essentially this is accepting without question the orders given to you by someone in a position of power over you. And the couple that you see here are 2 former German athletes from the 1980s, and I use them as an example. And they were, in a nutshell, they were given a little blue pill when they were athletes. It was unlabeled and unnamed, and they were told by their coaches that it was healthy and a useful vitamin, and so they took it over the span of their careers. Well, over a decade later, we found out that that was actually a steroid, and so they'd been taking, a very powerful steroid throughout their teenage and early adult years. And so I use this as an example to just kind of say, oftentimes there's people in positions over us, and it's, you know, hopefully we're never in a position where those people are doing something of this nature. However, it is important to be aware of that, and maybe at times it is of use to question that and just make sure we, you know, we are aware of what's being asked of us and who's asking it. And then finally, just making them aware of, you know, social and cultural factors. And the reality is, we, as much as we probably like to deny it, we all have personal biases. And so it's just important to be aware of those and make sure that we don't let those stop us from helping in situations where somebody needs our help. And so those are the factors that are believed to perpetuate this bystander effect. But importantly, we don't want to stop there. We then want to move on to, okay, so these are the things that we know the bystander effect exists. We know it's powerful. We know some of the factors that influence it. So how do we overcome it? And so here we move towards, we want to go from being passive bystanders to actively intervening in substance use situations. And so we then look at the 5 steps towards intervention. And you can see those here. And you'll notice that it's not until the 5th and final step that we actually are in a position where we can step in and help. And so in order for somebody to help, they need to go through each of these steps in order before they can actually help. And so what I do with student athletes is I take them through each of these steps, and again, I contextualize them within the context of substance use. So drawing upon real world examples of, you know, where we've seen people take these various steps. Again, unfortunately, I can't go through all the examples here, but I do want to take you through the steps. So the first step in helping is that we have to notice the event. And, you know, this probably sounds pretty petty and really obvious, but, you know, the reality is that, and for each of you, I don't know your situation, but certainly for me, prior to, you know, really focusing on this, I didn't know what red flags were in the context of substance use. And so one of the key things we want to do with React is we want to alert student athletes to red flags so that they are able to notice these events, because that's an important first step. And I'll share with you kind of later in the second session what some of those are. Then we need to interpret them as a problem. So not just notice these substance use red flags, but also see that as a problem. And, you know, for a lot of the student athletes, they'll probably have witnessed the situations that we present, but they've probably not realized that or interpreted them as a problem because they may not have kind of put them within the context of anti-doping. The next step is to assume personal responsibility. And this is where the majority of student athletes in my research were falling out kind of the steps, is that they recognize substance use, they interpret it as a problem, but they didn't necessarily feel like they had a role to play. And often it was because they didn't know what to do. And so obviously, again, that's something we want to address with React, is we want to equip them to be able to do something and take that personal responsibility. Then they need to know how to help. And here we're equipping them with skills, we're providing an opportunity to practice and giving them knowledge on the various aspects that are related to this bystander effect and intervention. And then finally, we get to the point where we can actually step in and help. And at this stage, through the use of a video, I reiterate to them that, you know, although we are going to go through some kind of specific strategies, the bottom line is we want them to do something, and something is better than nothing. So oftentimes we see that, you know, it just takes one person stepping up and doing something to empower and encourage those around them to get involved as well. And so we're encouraging student athletes to be that person that's willing to take that first step, no matter how small it is, and to realize that that's going to be better than not doing anything. So from there, having looked at the bystander effect, having looked at how we can overcome it, going from being passive to active, we then talk about specific strategies that can be utilized to actually step in and help. And so we start out with some basic ones, which many of us and many student athletes have probably used, which is just a simple cost-benefit analysis. So thinking about what would be the cost of intervening in this situation, and then what would be the cost of not intervening. And often what we find is the cost of not intervening, particularly the emotions, would likely last longer than the cost of intervening. And certainly there can be costs to intervening. And so it's important that we acknowledge that, but also we want to recognize that the cost is probably going to be greater if we don't intervene. We'll probably regret that more. And so we use specific examples that will have been drawn out of the videos at this point to help kind of bring this home for student athletes. And then we also talk about perspective taking. So putting yourself in that other person's shoes and what would you want them to do for you? So a really simple example, let's say student athletes in the gym and they see another student athlete using a pre-workout supplement that they know has a banned ingredient, they as the observer, but they're not sure if that student athlete knows. What do you do? Well, although you might be hesitant, I would encourage them to put themselves in that student athlete's perspective. What would you want someone to do for you? And chances are most of them are going to say, well, I'd want them to say something. And so this can be a really quick and easy way for them to think about, okay, yeah, actually, it is worth stepping in because I'd want someone to do that for me. Importantly, though, we also acknowledge that it can be difficult to speak out against or within a team and within a group, especially if it's against the norm. And so what we want to do through React is we want to kind of flip this on the side and say, well, let's create a culture where the norm is that you do step in and intervene. We want to create a culture where you know that if you confront a substance use situation, your teammates or the people around you are going to support you in that and have your back. And so we want to use this group as a strength rather than as a hindrance. And so we talk about some ways that we can do that within a group, such as, making this part of their goals or their standards that they set at the beginning of their seasons. And then we move on to social confrontation. And this is where we spend the majority of our time, again, based on what student athletes said in my research. So social confrontation is essentially an active conversation about a problem, the cause, and solutions. And, for all of us, I'm sure we've all experienced being confronted as well as confronting at some point in our lives in some capacity. But what we probably never thought about is factors that influence a successful confrontation. So a successful confrontation in the context of substance use would essentially be, presumably it would be that person stopping using that banned substance. And so we go through each of these factors that influence it. And just, on a basic level, legitimacy is whether or not a rule's been broken. Personal resources is factors related to me as the confronter, so like skills, time, energy. Outcome is what we think is going to happen as a result of the confrontation. Intimacy refers to the relationship between me and the target. And initiation is kind of, we lay out what we want to happen. And we make sure that we let the target know we have a problem with their behavior, not with them as a person, because we don't want them to automatically go on the defense. Following this, I present them with a quiz, and it's really a silly quiz. It has nothing to do with sport, but it gives them an idea of what their personality type might be and what type of confrontation they might be inclined towards. And so the quiz includes 5 questions. You can see one of them here. Obviously, as I said, it's completely irrelevant to sport. However, at the end of these 5 questions, student athletes are able to kind of tally up which ones they responded to most and identify where they lie along the spectrum of personal approach behaviors. And so once they've done this little quiz, I ask them, hey, are you surprised by your response? And generally they're not. They feel like it's accurate and represents their behavior or their personality type. And what they'll find is they'll fall somewhere along this spectrum. And so this is a spectrum of confrontation styles. And on one end, we have those people that are quite passive. So these are the people that are going to let the wants, rights, needs, and others kind of be prioritized over their own. And, they might get kind of stepped on in the process. On the other end, we have those people that tend to be very aggressive. And so they put their wants, needs, and rights of themselves above others. And they do what's best for them, without thinking about how that impacts those around them. And then somewhere towards the middle, we have assertive behavior. And these are the individuals that put the wants, needs, and rights of themselves on par with the wants, needs, and rights of others. And so they're looking to find a solution that's best for everyone involved. And generally speaking, we find this to be the most effective type of confrontation. But importantly, we make sure student athletes know there's no right or wrong way. It's just good to be aware of the different styles. And following that, we give them a video, and it's a video where it's a stage scene of a drunk girl at a bar and a guy trying to take advantage of her. And I stop it and we talk about, okay, how would each of these different styles intervene? What do you think an aggressive response would look like from somebody intervening? What do you think a passive response would look like? And then finally an assertive response. And so we have some discussion around how these different behaviors might play out, and equally whether or not they might be effective. And so again, this is just kind of on a general topic, not related specifically to sport, but oftentimes, it's an easy way for them to kind of see or consider these behaviors in action. And that leads us to our REACT model. And so from here on out, you're going to kind of see this on each of the slides. But essentially what it is we're, as I said, encouraging student athletes to intervene. And so we're encouraging them to go through these 5 steps and then to implement the help. And to implement their help, they're going to select a type of confrontation style that lies somewhere along this spectrum. And so student athletes continue to be prompted with this from here on out. Now, before I go into the second session, Laura, if you want to ask, I'd be interested in what level of athletes you guys are engaged with, as obviously this is, at the moment, targeting student athletes. However, the concepts can really translate into any level of athlete, regardless of how young or how old. So this would just kind of be of interest to me. And from there, we'll go into session 2. And so as I said, session 1 was about theories and introducing the skills. Session 2 then is where we actually contextualize these within specific substance use scenarios. And I wish I could go through the whole session with you, but obviously it's not possible given the session is 90 minutes long. Oh, cool. So quite a range. All right. Well, with that in mind, session 2, as I said, is where we introduce the substance use situations. So we look specifically at dietary supplements, appearance and performance enhancing drugs, prescription medications, and recreational drugs. And importantly, each of these have been shown by research to be quite relevant to student athletes or to the student athlete context. So this is why we target these specifically. We start out with dietary supplements, and I start out by asking how many of you have or are using some sort of dietary supplement, and to no surprise, quite a few student athletes are. But that, then I tell them, well, that's exactly why it's important that you're informed. And so, we talk about how dietary supplements are meant to be a supplement, not to be your main diet. And then we talk about some of the risks involved with supplements. So, certainly the possibility of contamination and giving them, we make them aware of the fact that, the dietary supplement industry in the US is largely unregulated. So we see a number, we're often seeing contaminated supplements, and very often these can be contaminated with banned ingredients. And so it's kind of raising awareness to the fact that, although oftentimes they may seem quite innocent, there are risks associated with that. So the mislabeling, the contamination, and then walking them through the process of recall. So just giving them some information around this. And we also, I share a video with them from a student athlete who also had health implications from it. So raising awareness to the fact that it's not just their eligibility that they should be concerned about, but also that, there can be health risks associated with dietary supplements. And so, just making sure that they're informed on that. And then also, I prompt them to know that, there are ways that if you are going to make the choice to use dietary supplements, make sure you do due diligence in trying to minimize the risks. And so at the bottom of the screen, you see the resources that are available to student athletes across the 3 countries. Within the NCAA in the US, they're encouraged to use drug-free sports, drug-free sport access. And here we emphasize that these are a great way to minimize risks, but also bear in mind they can't completely eliminate them. And so just, again, trying to give them as much information as we can so that they can make informed choices. We move on from there to appearance and performance enhancing drugs. And I would imagine most of you, as well as most student athletes, are more familiar with the term performance enhancing drugs, or PEDs. But we specifically use this term because the reality is these are not only being used for performance enhancing purposes. And certainly that's true within the student athlete and the student in general population as well. And so, it's just raising their awareness to the fact that they can be used for multiple different purposes. And you see the definition here. So APEDS refers to a range of substances, both legal and illegal, used for the purposes of changing one's outward appearance or improving their performance in some context. And then I give them the examples of kind of the ones that we probably hear about most often within sport. We then move on to prescription drugs, and the key here is their use without a personal prescription. So these, as most of you probably know, are banned within sport without a personal prescription. And the ones that we look at specifically are cognitive enhancement, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is a growing issue on university campuses worldwide, as well as within the student-athlete context specifically. And so cognitive enhancement is known as, or referred to as, the use of drugs and or other means with the aim to improve the cognitive functions of healthy subjects, in particular their memory, attention, creativity, and intelligence, again in the absence of any medical indication. And a key concern here is helping student athletes realize that it doesn't matter what their intention was behind the use. If they get drug tested and, for example, Ritalin or Adderall shows up in their drug test, they'll be held accountable for that within the context of sport. And so, you know, I've had a number of student athletes say, well, you know, if I use it for finals or I use it for homework, or, well, it doesn't matter. If you don't have a prescription to be using this, and it should be on file at their universities, if it shows up in your test, you'll be held accountable. And so again, this is encouraging them to be aware of the specific rules. And for a lot of them, thinking beyond the traditional idea of what anti-doping is. Another issue that we talk about is painkillers. And so here it's really highlighting kind of the potential dangers of painkillers. Well, number one, on a global context, that they're banned without prescriptions, but perhaps more importantly, the health risks associated with them. So painkillers are, as many of you probably know, now believed to be as addictive as heroin, and heroin's the most addictive drug that there is. So, you know, athletes are commonly prescribed painkillers for legitimate sport injuries, but it's important that they're aware of the fact that even if they're prescribed them, they're still addictive. And so this is, again, an opportunity just to be thinking about, you know, this idea of helping and when a situation may warrant help. So again, looking beyond the issue of just bans to actually caring about the people around you and yourselves. And then finally, we talk about banned street drugs, as the NCAA refers to them, or more commonly known as recreational drugs. And so you see here the most common ones that are banned. And again, this is an opportunity to reiterate the idea that it doesn't matter what your intentions were behind use. If these show up on your test in sport, you'll be held accountable. And so, you know, recreational drugs are rarely being used for performance-enhancing purposes. However, they're still banned in sport. And so they should not be being used in sport. And if they show up on their test, you know, they will be held accountable. And then importantly, throughout this session, as I said, it's 90 minutes and I've given you a very short version, but at 2 points, I present them with scenarios. And in little groups, they're asked, they're given a scenario, and then they're encouraged to discuss it amongst their group. And I give them 2 questions that follow it. So here's one of the scenarios that we use. And the scenarios are drawn from conversations I've had with student athletes. But in this situation, in groups of 4 or 5, they're encouraged to consider these 2 questions. So they read this, and I read them the scenario, and then they respond to these 2 questions. And they'll start out by doing it in their small groups, as I said. And then I generally pull them back together as a large group, and we're able to have discussion and debate around these issues. And really, just to kind of determine whether or not they see them as a problem. And you know, just an open opportunity to discuss these issues. And what I find is that for many of these student athletes, and probably for athletes in general, this is one of the first, if not the first time that they've ever had an opportunity to discuss issues like this openly and freely. And so it's an opportunity to kind of really start thinking about, you know, how might this issue relate to me? And so, as I said, we do this on 2 occasions, and then also on 2 other occasions, I present them with additional scenarios, and in this time in pairs, so in partners, they're asked to consider the scenario and fill out a worksheet. And it's obviously a little bit on a larger piece of paper than this, but what this worksheet does is it's essentially a game plan that takes them through a confrontation situation. And so, as you'll probably notice, the questions pertain to the factors that influence confrontation that I shared in the first session. And so in pairs, they go through and respond to these questions, thinking about this scenario and what a confrontation might look like and some of the factors that might influence it. And following this, I pull them back together, and in a group, we go through it, we walk through this worksheet and talk about, you know, what are some of the issues that popped out to you? And then they actually practice confronting. And, for the most part, their initial response is usually that they don't want to do it, which is not a surprise. However, once they actually get into it, this has been a really informative thing for the majority of them. So what they do is in their groups of 2, after going through this worksheet, one of them assumes the role of the confronter, one's the target, and they kind of essentially act out that scenario. And then they switch roles, so they experience being on both ends of it. And then I bring them back together as a group and we discuss what it was like. And, bearing in mind that they're generally within a group that is full of their peers and people that they know, for a lot of them, they'll highlight, that was really awkward, or I felt really uncomfortable. I didn't know what to say. I was unsure. And so this is an opportunity to highlight this idea that, the more you practice, the more familiar you are with these situations, the more likely you are to help if and when you're faced with them. And so a key part of REACT is giving them kind of facilitating opportunities for them to really think about how this would play out in the real world, so that they're actually prepared to do it and not having to answer these questions in that situation, but rather they've already considered them prior to it. And so this is really a key aspect of the REACT program. And then finally, we have them consider the cost of not intervening. So again, part of that cost-benefit analysis, and we highlight the fact that there can be bans for the athlete who tests positive. And then we also highlight that there can be implications if they want to have a career in sport in the future. And so we go through some of the specific anti-doping rules. And then we also get them thinking about, you might not be directly impacted by this person's behavior. However, they might impact somebody later down the line by using that banned substance. And so by not intervening now, you could be allowing this, a negative experience to happen to someone down the line. And this picture is highlights a girl who was impacted by fellow athletes who tested positive post-competition. And so they hear from this person, this Shannon Roberry. She talks about what it feels like to be impacted by others' use of performance-enhancing drugs. So again, just kind of helping them think about, the bigger picture here. Now, as I said, I wanted to finish with giving you some preliminary findings. And to date, we've only delivered in the Canada and the US, but and we've also only done the pre and post. So we've not yet got the findings back from the evaluation that's 3 months post delivery. But I would like to share with you some of the initial findings out of these first 2 evaluations. And so we've had a total of 311 complete data sets. So that's 311 student athletes who have completed the evaluation at the start of the session and at the end. And that's 190 who have taken part in the control and 121 in REACT. And what we found is that the general anti-doping education in the US and Canada for student athletes is that they take part in an online webinar essentially at the beginning of each academic year. But beyond this, student athletes would receive very little education, anti-doping education. And so as no surprise, what we found is that any type of in-person anti-doping education is better than none. So both groups showed increases in each of the areas that we measured. However, the REACT group generally showed more substantial increases in the things that we were measuring. And in particular, the REACT group showed stronger or more substantial increases in pro-social behavior when compared to the control group. And we saw this particularly in relation to the aims, the 3 key aims of REACT. So student athletes who went through the REACT groups showed stronger increases in reported skills and confidence towards confronting substance use behaviors, as well as a more substantial increase in their intentions to address banned substance use situations. Another interesting finding was that, as I said, we measured social norms, and within the REACT group, there was a stronger or a more substantial increase in the belief that their teammates would intervene in substance use situations after taking part in the intervention than there was before taking part in the intervention. And this is significant considering that social norms influence helping behaviors. And so by believing that that their peers are more likely to intervene, they themselves are therefore more likely to intervene. And certainly that is what our data is showing. But again, bear in mind that this is just preliminary data. However, quite encouraging and quite exciting as we get ready to deliver in the UK. And so in review, we've had the opportunity to kind of look at the React, the research underpinning React, the content of delivery, again, in a nutshell, and then some of these preliminary findings, which are suggesting that this is indeed a program that is increasing willingness and intentions, as well as awareness of intervention-worthy situations. So Laura, if you want to ask, I'd be curious to know, would React, or of the 4 substance use situations that I've shared with you, that we share with student athletes, which of those in your context do you currently see as being the biggest challenge that you face? And challenge being that, you know, it comes up the most, or you get the most questions about it, or just that you see it the most, however you want to interpret that. And this would be quite useful for us, as obviously we have a gauge within student athletes, but you know, moving forward, we'd like to get that as well with athlete support personnel. All right. Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah, so it looks about half of you are saying dietary supplements, but each of them comes up, which I think is quite interesting and quite useful to know. Also, Laura, if you want to ask about, you know, one of the things that is important to us is obviously at the moment we're delivering it to university student athletes, but we'd like to, you know, consider where else it might be of interest. So would this be of interest within your context, bearing in mind you guys represent different contexts? That would be quite useful to know. And then I'll give you one more question after, and then I'm going to open up the floor to you guys for questions. So please feel free to ask me as many questions as you may have. Yes, cool. Okay, well, that's great. And then finally, would you be interested in taking part in an adapted version of React? And what I mean by that is, as athlete support personnel, do you think that this would be of use to you in your context? Because this is, you know, I've had this question posed to me quite a few times actually, but as I've gone to universities and offered it to student athletes, they've then turned around and say, well, can we have it for our athlete support personnel as well? And so that's something we're thinking about moving forward is, you know, we'd like to make this kind of, take this full circle. So not just student athletes who are, you know, creating this culture of intervening and helping, but we want that to then be reinforced and kind of encouraged by those who are in the leadership roles above them. Awesome. Okay, well, that is definitely something for me to be thinking about. So with that, I would like to open the floor for any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and let Laura take control of that. I'm going to come back on the video because I feel like I should. And then I'll just leave this screen as you guys, so that you are able to follow React, as well as you can contact me. I update the Twitter quite often. We have a Facebook page. We also have a website. And there's a number of ways that you can get involved and kind of keep track of and keep up to date with where this project is going. So I'll put on my video, and Laura, you're up.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey. Yeah, that's definitely extremely informative here. I'm going to go ahead and take the controls back. I can put that slide back up here in a second, but
okay, cool.
I'm going to just go through a few things. If you are still on today's webinar and have a few questions for Dr. Erickson, please feel free to use the question bar and answer or ask those, and we'll get those to her. And while we're waiting for those to come in, I just want to make sure that everybody's kind of aware of a few other things coming up for drug-free sport. Of course, we have a number of free education programs and services, just like today's webinar series. Drug-free sport access is available to a number of subscribing organizations that Kelsey mentioned in her presentation as well. If you haven't been a part of our monthly education emails, those again are free, and it's just once a month on new trending topics such as React or things related to clean sport, anti-doping, dietary supplements, and a lot of those issues that many of you mentioned in that poll question. Also, our e-newsletter and our blog are great ways to stay informed. If you want additional information on any of these topics, you can also find those through our Speakers Bureau by having on-site training, customized webinars on issues or emails, and then also our Sport Exchange Summit, which is a multidisciplinary conference event. And so this is a great time to bring athletic trainers in front of strength and conditioning coaches and dietary or sports nutrition folks, team physicians, to learn in a collaborative event so that we can build and bridge stronger communication channels, even with something related to clean sport, to make sure that everybody's sending the same message to athletes. And finally, we do have another webinar coming up here at the close of May in just the next week or so, and this will be on your top 10 NCAA related questions. So we do run a number of education programs for NCAA institutions, just like today's webinar was specific to student athletes, but we want to make sure that we get the right information out there to all of those partners working behind the scenes, and ensuring that the most reliable information is in your hands so that you can educate your team, your staff, as well as your athletes in a reliable manner. So I'll kind of switch back to Kelsey's slide here, just so you can have her contact information. And again, we can have all of this available online. So far, we don't have too many questions coming in. In fact, none at all, which is I find shocking because it's quite of interest, I think, to me. I guess I'll start by asking the first one, but Kelsey, what do you think, or what do you anticipate the impact of your research being in the long run? How will you use this information after you've taken all the data and gone into the UK and completed the program?
Yeah, that's a great question. At the moment, there's a number of different avenues, but certainly one is, I guess the key one is just creating a shift in anti-doping education. And so moving away from it being kind of an opportunity of sharing information and rules and regulations, but to recognizing the complexity of this issue, and that, things like relational factors can be quite significant. And so our vision moving forward is that, this becomes mainstream for student athletes, but also beyond athletes. And certainly the skills and the techniques that they're learning, such as confrontation, or primarily confrontation, is applicable in many other avenues outside of substance use and even outside of sport. And so it's kind of using life skills to help student athletes create a culture, or help athletes really create a culture that they want to be a part of. And so our vision is to make it accessible on a larger scale, so that institutions can implement it in their own environment in a way that's relevant to them, as well as different sports organizations, et cetera. And then also to adapt it specifically to athlete support personnel. Because one thing we know is that, athlete support personnel are often bombarded with issues related to substance use, and yet, similar to athletes, they're getting limited education. So we want to make it, as I said, something that's being kind of taught on all levels.
Great. Well, this really does bring us right up to the end of the hour here. So I want to thank you again for taking your time, Kelsey, for joining us and definitely delivering this remarkable information. I think it's exciting to hear that this type of a program is being studied, and I guess I speak for everybody on the call, just that we're really eager to see the end result of all of your data sets. So definitely keep us informed, and maybe we'll have a regroup of a webinar when you have all of that said and done. So,
sounds great. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for attending.
All right. Thanks, everybody.